Hi, everybody. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Tuesday, February 4th today, and I'm sitting down to talk about the meaning of Mercury in the sign of Pisces. So this is a transit that just began yesterday, and I'm going to share it with you on the screen so that you can see it first. And I'm going to talk about its significance. A lot of people have questions about this planetary transit because Mercury is classically said to be in its fall or depression in the sign of Pisces. So naturally, that comes with a lot of questions, both if you're born with it or if it's transiting in the sky and you hear that language, you can freak out, or whatever. You can easily just be like, "Oh no, what does that mean?" So Mercury entered Pisces yesterday, classically the place of both its detriment and its fall. And here's what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks. We're going to see Mercury move along until it turns retrograde right around the 17th. And then you'll notice that Mercury will be in Pisces and retrograde for a while. I don't have it pictured right now, but Neptune's also in Pisces. It'll dip back into Aquarius a little bit, station around, what is it, like March 10th or 11th, move forward back into Pisces, and then it's there on March 16th, and it goes all the way into April, like April 10th or 11th or something like that, April 10th, 11th, before it finally bumps back into Aries. So you're looking at Mercury in about as difficult a position in terms of its essential dignity as it could be in for about 2 months now, and that started yesterday. How did we see that in the news? Very easily. We saw it in the Iowa caucuses here in the United States anyway. Major malfunction. Totally feels like a Mercury retrograde kind of thing. It's not a Mercury retrograde yet, for a couple of days in that shadow period, but it has to do with the fact that Mercury, whenever a planet ingresses into a new sign, it makes a splash. And here you have Mercury diving into a water sign where it's debilitated in two different categories and makes for more difficult retrogrades. I mentioned this to people. I had a very crappy travel experience like a year ago during Mercury retrograde in Pisces. So, any of the normal stuff with Mercury this badly debilitated can apply. So, what is that? That's going to mean, trouble with travel plans, trouble with technological malfunctions, anything related to communication, planning, organization, contracts, technology that you buy, whatever. So you're going to be careful around all of that stuff. I've also learned to be really patient. Something is on the fritz during a Mercury retrograde, like wait a few weeks, and sometimes it just turns out fine. We don't need to freak out. It's weird, but I'm always just a little cautious about being really reactionary with things that I do or don't do as soon as something goes wrong under a Mercury retrograde. So just being careful not to be totally reactive. But it can be a little bit worse than usual because of the strong sign of debility here. Let's explain this debility so that it sounds weird. So classically, there was a text from Rhetorius, the compendium of astrology, and this is a Hellenistic source text that we rely on in Hellenistic astrology. And Rhetorius is explaining why planets are exalted in some signs but depressed in other signs. And he says, why is it that Mercury is exalted in Virgo, in the sign where Venus is depressed or fallen, and in Pisces, on the other hand, where Venus is exalted, there Mercury is depressed. And he says, we say that it's because Mercury is the sign of the intellect, and where the intellectual is augmented, there the sensual is decreased or depressed, and where the sensual is made bigger or greater, exalted, then then we have the intellectual is depressed. So repeat that again. Mercury is about smart, heady, intellectual, rational stuff, let's say, among other things, and does really well in Virgo. And that place doesn't do well for Venus because Venus is very sensual versus Mercury being more intellectual. Reverse it, and you got Venus exalted in Pisces, and Mercury is depressed. Well, what's the reasoning behind these two signs? Well, obviously, Pisces sits on the cusp of spring. And so where there is that spring energy and that increase in sensuality, appetite, lust, pleasure, we're getting into the body. It's like everything's mating during spring. The flowers are appearing, colors are appearing. That's when Venus is exalted. She's lifted on high. But when the end of the year is coming and everything's moving toward the harvest, the we reap what we've sown, and judgment awaits, and death is upon us. And right at that point, we start releasing the body, we start releasing the senses, and the mind becomes more enhanced. So there's a trade-off between Mercury and Venus. And we see this even, for example, in the difference between Virgo and Libra, who have what is called a contra antitia with one another. The sign of Virgo, of course, we already know, related to the planet Mercury traditionally. And you can think of this as like in terms of the preparation for harvest. There's a lot of sorting, analyzing, cognitive, rational, objectivity, detachment, etc. We need in order to learn a skill, carefully discern, differentiate, discriminate, etc. So Mercury is the kind of the intellectual, organizing, articulating, differentiating faculty. And when we go into, and it's a critical part of how we make decisions, how we know what is true, how we know what is right, because we have a rational intellect, rational intelligence, and how to put that to use in the world in the right, good, pure, wholesome way is also concerned Virgo. Now, when we come to Libra, we're also getting into go from preparation for harvest, you could say, into the judgment moment. And the judgment moment, with, you think the image, the scales, but you think of the image of the Lady Justice with her blindfold, and you think about Libra as a sign of judgment, of evaluation, and of judgment, which is very similar to, or very different. Whereas Virgo discerns, discriminates mentally and rationally, Libra is about value comparisons and the weighing and measuring of values in a more sensual and embodied manner. For example, a very superficial Libran form of judgment would be, do you like this color scheme versus that color scheme? Not as important maybe, and some people might say, well, that's not very important, right? But it turns out that there is some way in which these two faculties need to come together, because when they're opposed to one another, we get in trouble. When there's too much rational, heady intellect, and we don't have a feeling for the world around us, and we might have knowledge, but knowledge devoid of beauty is not actually knowledge, according to the ancient Greeks. And even Indian philosophers, I think, would say so. Certainly in the Bhakti tradition, we believe the same thing. So Mercury, who represents knowledge, and Venus, who represents sensual beauty and love and connectiveness in relationships, the two of them need to come together. Because if Libra, for example, it can go in the opposite direction as well, where if Libra, if you think Venus Libra and you think of judgments like, oh, well, I think that girl is pretty, but oh, that other one, like a gossip column or something, oh, sure, I hate her hair or something like that. Superficial value judgments. That's what Libra can struggle with. But Libra also, just like the justice is blind, has to do with developing deeper felt relational sense of justice and truth that is also justice, truth, and beauty. Virgo can struggle with something very similar. Virgo Mercury can have all sorts of intellectual, rational breakdown and analysis of things, but may sometimes lack heart, which is why you'll hear archetypal psychologists talking about the classic literary symbolism of the virgin versus the whore, which is a classic sort of dichotomy, sort of two sides of the same coin. And you'll have, sort of Virgo sometimes representing, sort of chastity, but it's sort of lifeless and mechanical, and tends to be very critical and sort of hyper aware and judgmental, but in ways that are very sort of mental and nervous. And on the other hand, you'll have, sometimes you see the Virgo needs to break their own rules and swing to some extreme and experience something that's more sensual, that's more passionate. That's why you often see, Virgos who are, like librarian, this sort of image, it's very stereotyped, but like librarian by day, pole dancer by night. You know what I mean? Like, so obviously it's just a joke, but the the idea of there being this dichotomy between the mental and the sensual is that, and how those two things go together when discerning what is good, right, and true, how to be in the world, how to be useful, how to be good, how to be pure, how to do something that makes a difference in the world. These are not just analytical decisions, they're where the analytical and the rational mind meet the embodied sensuality of Venus. This is why Venus and goddesses are traditionally associated with the marriage of learning and beauty. Because again, you have to remember the Greeks thought that truth was ultimately not just true, but it was a combination of true, good, and beautiful. And so all those things that they sometimes we make a false dichotomy out of those things. We say, well, if it's rational and it can't be sensual, or vice versa. That's the kind of tension that is really present within Mercury's position in Pisces. So Mercury in Pisces in the exaltation of Venus is in its fall. So some of the basic things you can see people struggling with are going to be like this, like anything that you're trying to justify intellectually that's based on a fleeting material desire. I want to spend money. I want to do this. I want to do that because it's going to gratify my senses. And I end up rationalizing it when I know rationally that it's just something I want to do. So rationalizing, maybe let's say indulgent attitudes or illusory desires, fantasies, and mentally being able to justify it, you have to be careful of that. On the other hand, to be seduced mentally and emotionally, to be manipulated emotionally and mentally, people who want you to be or think or do or act or speak or behave in a certain way, and they try to kind of seduce you into doing something that they want, or that is for some element of their own desire, their own ends. So you have to be a little bit aware of that. Boundaries in communication, gossip, trying to play, like for example, I was thinking of this earlier, how you put my daughter in timeout. She got in trouble, so she has to sit on the couch for a couple minutes, calm down, etc. Think about it, and then while she's in timeout, suddenly she cries out, "I cut my finger! I cut my finger!" And I go over there and I'm like, "You did not cut your finger at all." I look and she's like, "Well, but it kind of hurt." So sometimes she has the tactic, of trying to override uh, like she'll try to take advantage of my emotional responses, right? And try to come over, instead of like reflecting on what she's done and why she's in timeout, she come up with ways of kind of like manipulating me over. And she doesn't want me to be upset, right? She thinks she's upset me. And so also, if I can get dad's sympathy, so I'll say, "I love you. It's okay. Your finger, let me give it a kiss. Okay, you're still in timeout." Like, we can do that though. We're adults, but we still do things like that, where we might try to manipulate someone's sympathy, or someone may try to manipulate ours. So anything where the intellectual and the feeling oriented or the sensual overlap in ways that are complicated or possibly destructive, you have to be very aware of all of that. The potential for anything ranging from gossip, emotional manipulation, deception, secrets, etc., to be a little toxic is certainly there. On the one last kind of negative thing that we'll mention will just be that there's also the potential to be taken in by, let's say, ideas, teachings, fantasies, images that we are not thinking through carefully enough. That's important. For example, being susceptible to information that's false or untrue somehow. So watch for that as well. Now, on the upside, of course, this can be a very highly intuitive place for Mercury. Many lyrical artists, poets, people who can get into a stream of consciousness when they write, people who channel a voice, people who, I'm trying to think of what those books were called. I don't remember, there was like an angel or something. Anyway, so, or like when you think of things like A Course in Miracles, there's a book that everyone should probably know, where there's this idea of this almost like this channeled voice coming from another world. Sometimes that stuff, I'm not saying Course in Miracles, but sometimes that stuff is going to take advantage of you right now, take advantage of your pocketbook or your better judgment. But on the other hand, sometimes you'll find things that are really otherworldly and truly inspired. You might have foresight, or you might have a moment of sort of mini prophecy, or what a precognition. That's what I'm thinking of. Things like that, altered states of consciousness, learning in ways that are more embodied and sensual, learning, I want to say, through nature, through signs and omens and symbols in nature, in dreams, for there to be more of a creative flow. That's pretty good indication of Mercury in Pisces. But of course, also the sense of the rational mind being taken over or diminished greatly. That sometimes that has to happen for creative flow states to come through, but it can happen also while leaving us vulnerable, right? Like, some people, when they go into deeply creative or inspired states, they get a little manic or a little crazy, and they may also start binging or not thinking carefully about what they're putting into their mind or body. People get into a creative state, and sometimes they're more susceptible to also like starting to take drugs or to drink, or so be careful about boundaries, even if you are going into some extraordinary creative like downloads or whatever. So I think those are some of the things to be aware of, both negatively and positively. It's a long retrograde period. You can also be really psychosomatic during this period, because Mercury in Pisces will indicate the mind being very porous in connection to the immune system, and also in connection to the feet. So watch for those things. It's also a very good time to explore the teacher-student dynamic in your life. Like, who are your teachers? Who are your students? Maybe you have people who look to you for advice, even like your own children. And to get back into beginner's mind with something, where our sense of rationally understanding might feel a little overwhelmed, but that's actually a good thing. There's some way in which we may need to be opened to something new by being overwhelmed by what we don't know, or by what is confusing, complex, foggy. Sometimes we get through Mercury retrogrades this way, no matter what the retrograde is, where it's best to think of Mercury as the god who can go into the underworld, come out, is comfortable in invisibility, and may need to work beneath the surface a little bit in order to give us some messages or some lessons between now and say the middle of April. So trust the process and let your emotions guide you, but don't be like, I saw a book the other day that basically said, stop listening to your emotions. It was like the title of the book or something. I was like, what? And I looked at it, and it ended up being basically just someone pushing back on that sort of really popular idea that you should always just completely trust your feelings and trust your gut. And this was like, yeah, your emotions are good, but like, let's not go crazy here. It should be some combination of your intellect and your felt sense of things. Similarly, our need for pleasure, happiness, our desire body, the need for beauty, should go along with and should not be in conflict with our need for careful thinking, rationality, and truth. So beauty and truth. And let's think about, combining those qualities and looking at places in our lives where we might dichotomize them a little bit too much. And a lot of that will happen with where we tend to rationalize something that isn't actually that might be beautiful or sensually appealing, but isn't true, is somehow we're not thinking about it carefully enough, or someplace where we're overthinking something, and we may need to loosen up a little bit and let sort of sensual connection with the world around us flow back in. And that's why that ultimately that juxtaposition that we see between Virgo and Libra, and oftentimes contained a lot within the sign of Virgo itself, Mercury's domicile and exaltation, is the archetype between the virgin and the whore. And that, like I said, they're really two sides of the same coin once you start unpacking the symbolism around their tension and their opposition. So put in another way, remember that wise thinking should be beautiful and beauty should be intelligent. So that's what I've got for you guys. Tell me your stories. How are you doing with Mercury in Pisces already? Any fun stories to share? If you're born with it natally, how do you get along with it? Maybe everyone can learn something from you. And I look forward to reading your comments, and I'll probably, track this transit out a bit more in the weeks ahead. So, okay, take care, everyone. Bye.